early days of STOs, and there are a couple of projects working on developing exchanges where they can then trade those securities tokens. We are at early days though, so I'll maybe just touch through some on the ASX. I think back in the day it was T+3 and it's come down. Whether we get to T, blockchain technically could do that, but there are some vested interests involved. So I don't know if we'll ever get to T even using blockchain on the ASX, but we're definitely going to shorten the time frame for settlement by using blockchain. And if you're building a security exchange from the ground up, then you can target basically immediate settlement. Fractional ownership. So it allows you to divide underlying assets into smaller units. So as opposed to a company where they sell shares and you get a fraction of a business, which is the overall business, you're able to fractionalise any asset within a business. So you can fractionalise artwork, you can fractionalise exotic cars, you could fractionalise your cafe, or you could fractionalise a tractor. So what this will allow in time is super tailored asset allocation. You don't need to buy the whole company. You'll be able to buy a very targeted piece of a business or any other asset. And making illiquid assets otherwise liquid, automobiles and finance, which I just mentioned. Regulated. So as opposed to ICOs that were outside of the financial services system, they're not financial products, most of them. If you're running an STO, you're subject to all the normal Corporations Act requirements. Depending on your fundraising structure and the amount you're raising and your target market, whether it's above or below $10 million, whether it's retail, wholesale money, there's different disclosure requirements. So it might be a PDS, might be an information memorandum, could be an offer information statement. There is definite disclosure requirements. So what it does, it gives more consumer protections, and it gives a bit more legitimacy to the offering as well. Immutability of records due to use on the blockchain. Can be traded on global markets 24/7. So this is a really cool element. So what this will enable is global liquidity for fractionalised assets. So you look at all these things that can play to the advantage of securities tokens offerings. I think this will be the future. I think platforms that develop to offer these securities tokens will be kind of at the next level. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about STOs over the next year or two. Disadvantages. At the moment, there are limited exchanges. I think there's a couple of exchanges in the States where you can trade STOs. There are a few in development, but at the moment, it is a bit limited.
A question. So take an Norton of it, so you fractionalise bits and
Sure.
you've got bits all over the place. So that means you've got hundreds of owners effectively.
Correct.
Sort of makes, in the end, it become illiquid because what can you do with it?
Okay, so you're effectively taking a big asset,
Yeah.
sorry, or you're taking any asset. You take your car, so an exotic car. Rather than have to just have the money to be able to buy that asset by itself, you fractionalise it, then you sell it. So we all own 1/40th, give or take however many people there are, 1/40th of this exotic car. If I want to sell my 1/40th of that car, I can put that for sale on a securities token exchange, and anyone else in the world that wants to buy into that asset can then buy that asset. So it doesn't need to be traded back into this group. It can be traded more broadly.
So the question is, what's the financial benefit of owning 1/40th of a luxury car? I can't have control, I can't use it.
Yeah.
So what's the purpose?
Yeah, you don't actually drive the car, but it's about it getting access to another asset, as in an investment.
Yeah, but for what? If I
For
can't make money
investment.
from it, yeah, if I
You-
invest into a
yeah.
Ferrari and own 1,000, how's that going to make you money?
Yeah, so exotic cars as an asset class, I'm not a financial advisor, but exotic cars are an investment asset class all by themselves. So if the right car is purchased, like if you bought a 1974 Porsche Carrera, and if that's in good condition, the $60,000 that you paid for it, I was born in 74, so 44 years ago, that car is now worth significantly more. So if you maintain that asset like an artwork, it enables lots of people to be able to get access to an asset class that perhaps heretofore they hadn't been able to access. You can't actually drive the car though. You've only got to that car.
Why can't you list these security tokens on an existing exchange, if the exchange will accept it? What is the regulatory reason? It's a two-pronged question.
Sure.
And secondly, if you're selling, say, 1 ounce of gold, I presume it's exempt because you've got a token that represents an asset, not part of an asset. It's exempt from ASIC guidelines, according to ASIC anyway.
Okay, I'll address the first part first.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. Okay, so actually, what was the first part again? I'm thinking about gold.
Why can't we list, why can't
Okay,
an
the
STO
exchange-
be listed
the
on an
exchange
existing exchange?
Sure. So, exchanges at the moment, if you're listing tokens which aren't financial products, so like Bitcoin, say, for example, is a pure cryptocurrency, it's not a financial product. It's not a managed investment scheme, it's not a derivative, it's not a cash payment facility, it's a pure cryptocurrency. An exchange can list that and make that available. If an exchange is making a financial product available, then it needs a license, an AFSL, to make that product available. So it's like if I'm running an ICO and it's effectively a managed investment scheme, so I'm pooling money and I'm going to buy some property, and then the people who have purchased those tokens become a part owner in that property. It's like a property unit trust effectively. That's a managed investment scheme. The ICO operator needs a license to run that. An exchange operator, which is making that token available to the public to buy and sell, also needs a license to operate, to make that available.
So given you've got those two, why can't you do it?
No, we don't have an AFSL.
Okay, you don't.
No, so at the moment there are no exchanges in Australia that are AFSL holders. None of them. This is an emerging space. So ASIC has been really clear in its guidance. That info sheet 225, it talks about not only how ICOs can fall into the financial services regime, but it talks about how digital asset exchanges or exchanges that are making available these tokens can also fall into the financial services regime. And if you're making available financial product tokens, security tokens, managed investment schemes, etc., then the exchange needs a license to make those available.
Before you get on to the gold, can I have a follow on that?
Sure.
So you've got the initial one, you've got the exchange here, you've got your AFSL, but you're now doing exchange globally. You have to have licenses in all those other places where it could be traded.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. At the moment, none of the overseas exchanges are licensed, so none or in Australia. So they're not actively marketed in Australia. And the reach of ASIC to go out to an overseas exchange, not fantastic. So as long as they're not being actively marketed, ASIC, at least at this stage, has been relatively benign. Now what we're doing is we're looking to go down the AFSL path, go down the markets license path, because we are supported by one of the big boys in the crypto world. So that allows us to have the capacity, it gives us the capacity basically to run these license applications, which they're not cheap. For the people that are the lawyers in the space in the financial services world, they take time and they take resources. So that will knock out some of the smaller players, the fringe players. That plays to the benefit of large-scale operators like ourselves. Now, with the gold question,
Yes. I'm using gold as an example. I issued a token representing 1 ounce of gold. It's not a fraction of anything. It's 1 ounce. It's asset backed. It's in store.
sure.
And we've got coins in Singapore and so on. As
Yeah.
you know.
Now, potentially that could be considered as a derivative. So if the value of the token is directly linked to another asset, potentially ASIC might see that as being a derivative. I mean, there's some other requirements around what a derivative is, but there's scope for them to interpret that as being a derivative, which is a financial product, which means you need a license to offer it on your exchange.
Only an AFSL though, isn't it?
AFSL, correct.
Yeah. Although today they've said to me, not required.
Okay.
Today.
Remember I said there was that wriggle room?
On their letterhead.
Haven't got it in writing yet, but today.
If you can get that, yeah, happy to see that one too.
Oh, good.
Yeah, depending on how it's valued, and there are some stable coins out there that appear to tick the boxes. You know, they're set up in the right way, they're potentially managed investments. The initial part might be a managed investment scheme, but they're going through the right licensing steps. There are some that are clearly going to be considered as derivatives or financial products, which is why, as the head of legal and compliance for Orbi Australia, I'm mindful of the tokens that we put on our exchange, because when we go through that license application process, I need to make sure we're as clean as possible. And it's not only Orbi's reputation. I've been in finance for 20 years. It's my reputation as well.
So if I can get that letter from ASIC, you'll buy it from me.
Okay, so yeah, at the moment there are only a couple, I think, of STO exchanges, but as this really takes wing, the increased regulatory oversight, increased consumer protections, broadly improves the legitimacy of the space, which I think is a really positive step. I'm mindful of the time, so convergence. Just a quick one on where the insto players are moving and where I see the future there. So Goldman Sachs acquired one of the big cryptocurrency exchanges, Poloniex. They see the movement into this space. Chartered Financial Analyst course now has two full subjects on blockchain. Really cool one. I'm going to use this point. I haven't used it before. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Fidelity. They've just recently announced a insto custody solution. So one of the big things holding institutions back from moving into the crypto space is custody. There have been hacks on exchanges. Thankfully, Orbi has never been subject to a successful hack. I say that. Like, never been subject to a successful hack. But it's the security of assets. So having worked for asset managers, if you can't keep your customers' assets safe, it doesn't matter how good the performance will be, you're not going to risk your customers' money. So with Fidelity launching this solution for insto investors, that's a really exciting step. Hedge funds are moving into the space, and there was another one actually, not there. Yale.
One's going to be issued in December.
Sorry?
One's issuing in December, please, custodians.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether it's Fidelity or one of the others, Benson or one of the others.
Yeah, there are a couple.
Three applications.
Yeah, I think these. When Fidelity made that announcement, that kind of that got me excited because
it will be good.
Well, it's the traditional big players in finance. Like it just makes sense that they've got the basic infrastructure, custody. They just need to set up the new processes, but it just makes sense that they've got the reputation, they've got the assets, they've got the ability to be able to move into these spaces. And Yale as well, the Yale Endowment Fund, it was announced, there was a report a few months ago, I think, a couple of months ago, that they've just invested into a big blockchain, a big cryptocurrency fund. And if Yale is doing, I know that they tend to be a bit more aggressive, a bit more tech-based in their investment approach, but if they're doing it, then they do good due diligence. That encourages other big institutions to do due diligence, and hopefully you can see a convergence of traditional and future tech and moving into space. Thank you.
Derek, now ask Andrew to present. Thank you.
Got a cool pointer.
Yes.
So this is the pointer, yeah?
The top button, yeah.
Okay.
And the big button is
Cool. All right. So this is me. We'll skip that. So wanted to talk to you about
fintech regulation landscape in China, in particularly focusing on blockchain and crypto assets. And crypto assets will include Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as well. So this slide, which I won't talk about in details, you can look at it on the screen while I speak. It basically charts the key regulatory milestones that's in China over the last 5 years in terms of fintech regulation, focusing on blockchain and also focusing on crypto assets. 5 years is a very long time, especially in a fast-growing economy such as China. It's also a very long time in a fast-growing sector such as fintech. So a lot of things has happened, as you can see, in terms of the regulatory things. It's also good to take a step back and think about what's been happening, I guess, from an economic perspective as well. So if we use the price of Bitcoin, I guess, as a measure, if you like, of how hot the fintech sector is in China, about 5 years ago, I think on the 28th of November of 2013, the price of Bitcoin crossed the $1,000 mark for the first time in history. And if you fast forward 4 years, in November of last year, it crossed the $10,000 mark for the first time in history. It then shot up, I think, to about $17,000 in December of last year, and then it's been on a slight decline since then. And overnight, I think it dropped below $6,000 for the first time this year. So it's a very volatile asset class. But because of the volatility, that actually helps explain some of the Chinese regulatory response to Bitcoin and other crypto assets as well. The other interesting statistic, which you won't see from here, is that for a period of time, the Chinese RMB, which is the official currency in China, the RMB and Bitcoin, accounted for about 98% of all Bitcoin-related transactions in the world. So if you look at it from that perspective, you can understand why the Chinese regulators are quite interested in regulating this particular asset and transactions related to this particular asset, especially if you think about Chinese regulators' concerns about capital flows, foreign exchange, and monetary policy in general. So that's the economic side of things. Obviously, the Chinese fintech sector, as you can imagine, has also grown very quickly over the past 5 years as well. If you asked somebody a player in fintech 5 years ago, who are the largest, which are the largest fintech companies in the world, they probably won't name a lot of Chinese companies. Whereas if you fast forward 5 years, so last year there was a FinTech 100 report, and in that report, the first, the second, and the third, I guess most promising. I don't think I'll go into a lot of technical detail. This is more sort of introductory. I think to understand Chinese fintech regulation, and in fact to understand Chinese regulation in terms of finance or economic reforms, it's really good to sort of take a step back and look at some of the underlying themes. So these are the 4 themes that I would argue are the drivers behind most Chinese fintech regulation and probably the drivers behind most Chinese economic reforms these days. So the first one is about, I'm going to use this thing. The first one is about economic reform in China. So a lot of people here would have heard about, it's a cliche now, but a lot of people would say that China's economy has entered into or is entering into a new normal. So what does the new normal mean? Basically, it's about saying goodbye to double-digit growth in terms of GDP. That's largely driven by cheap exports and sort of becoming the world's sort of, the world sort of factory, and really transitioning that towards a more sustainable, high-quality economic growth that's really backed by technological innovation, high-end manufacturing, and also significant domestic consumption. And as you can imagine, technology is at the core of that economic transformation, and the Chinese government has said in a number of places that it wants China to become the next innovation and technological powerhouse, and a lot of these reforms are directed towards that. The second bit is about innovation and entrepreneurship. Those two are obviously linked. It's the case in any jurisdiction, not just in China, that real innovation, true innovation, doesn't really take place in a boardroom, doesn't really take place in sort of a very hierarchical, large corporate space. It really sort of takes place as, in the case of the US, it'll probably be, in a garage of a bunch of college dropouts, In the case of China, it will be Jack Ma's apartment in Hangzhou, where he and some friends started thinking about Alibaba. And I think the Chinese government realizes that sort of innovation takes place at the grassroots, and the Chinese government is very keen at in sort of encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship, especially around sort of for young people as well. So if you look at only these two themes, it looks like it's a very positive, very encouraging environment for fintech to grow in China, which it is the case. But I also want you to keep in mind that there are two other themes underlying a lot of these regulations as well. And the first is financial stability, and the other is social stability, and the two are linked. But as you can imagine, these themes, they're not all consistent with each other, they're not all harmonious, there are tensions with each other, and they actually pull regulators and decision makers in China in different directions. So often you'll find that the particular direction or the particular tone that a particular regulation takes really depends on which of these levers or themes have a greater pull in a particular situation. So financial stability, obviously in every financial system around the world there are some risks. Some people would say that the whole purpose of finance is to allocate risks appropriately among different players. So that's fine, sort of an acceptable level of risk in financial systems are generally considered a good thing and a necessary thing. But what I'm talking about here and what the Chinese government and regulators are very concerned about is systemic financial risk. This is all about sort of a certain degree or type or amount of risk within a financial system that is so significant that it can basically, if things go wrong, it can basically cause a regional or even a global financial crisis. And the Chinese government really, really doesn't want that to happen. And the reason they don't want that to happen is because it's linked to social stability in China. So the current economic and political environment in China is that, as you know, the government has a lot of control over the economy and over the financial system as well. And when you have that much control, people expect a degree of accountability or responsibility as well. So what happens is when people invest in, there's a lot of retirees in China, when they invest in stocks and the stocks fall, they tend to blame the government, whether it's reasonable or not, they tend to do that. And similarly, when they invest, or if they invest in an ICO, and they lose money, they also tend to blame the government as well. So taking all of that into account, the government does want to keep financial risks, and especially systemic financial risks, under control. And they're doing that by targeting both the regulated or the traditional financial sector, which is dominated by banks, insurance companies, as in China operate. So having talked about these themes, I want to sort of just go through at a high level how these different themes play out in the context of 4 specific areas. So the first one is going to be Bitcoin and crypto assets. The second one is going to be ICOs, and then I'm going to talk about central bank issued digital currency, and then finally I'm going to talk about blockchain. So Bitcoin and other crypto assets, there is, so the legal status is interesting, and Derek touched on this before. People would often say to you that Bitcoin and other crypto assets are illegal in China. The truth is it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that. So the legal status of the actual asset itself is legally recognized in China. Chinese regulators have said that. There's a Shenzhen Arbitration Court going through a sort of pretty detailed legal analysis, coming to the same conclusion that basically a Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency is basically recognized as a type of asset in China. It's often referred to as a virtual commodity or a private financial asset, but basically it's an asset. But what the Chinese regulators do emphasize in a lot of their statements is that just because Bitcoin is often referred to as a virtual currency or a cryptocurrency, it actually is not the same as the currency as in cash or legal tender. And they make a big emphasis about that because if you have a lot of retail, unsophisticated investors, they might not appreciate that distinction when somebody says this is Bitcoin, this is virtual currency, this is just like the money in your wallet. It actually is not. And one of the key distinctions, I guess, between a virtual currency or a cryptocurrency and an actual legal tender is a legal tender is something that can basically be used for all kinds of purchases and services within a jurisdiction, and you actually can't basically refuse it. So if somebody owes you a debt and they wanted to pay you that in Australian dollars, in Australia, you can't refuse it. Similarly, if you go to a shop in Australia, you want to buy something that's labeled $5 Australian, you give them $5 Australian, legally they can't refuse that because it's legal tender and they have to accept it for the payment of both private and public debts. And that's a key characteristic of legal tender that only the official currency, I guess, of a particular jurisdiction has. That's the case in Australia, that's the case in China, in most jurisdictions as well. Financial stability I talked about a lot, and because of the volatility of Bitcoin and other crypto assets, the Chinese regulators are very worried about speculation in this particular investment class or asset class. So when Bitcoin prices were on the rise, at about towards the end of 2013, the Chinese regulators, and by that I mean basically the central bank, which is the PBOC, People's Bank of China, the securities, banking, insurance regulators, and a number of other internet-related regulators basically came out with a statement warning investors about risks, again emphasizing that Bitcoin is not currency, it's very volatile. What they also did was to say, and this is related to the financial stability point I was talking about, they basically didn't want China's regulated official financial system to be too involved in Bitcoin transactions. So they basically banned Chinese banks and other payment institutions from engaging in what they refer to as Bitcoin-related business, which basically means accepting Bitcoin as payment or facilitating exchanges between Bitcoin and RMB or Bitcoin and other types of currencies. So they wanted to break the linkage, I guess, between Bitcoin, crypto assets, and China's financial system. And they continued to do that towards the end of last year. Again, when Bitcoin prices were sort of going up and up, they basically decided to up the ante in terms of enforcement and in terms of imposing the ban, and basically essentially has the effect of banning crypto asset exchanges that operate within China. Very quickly on initial coin offerings. So Derek already told you all of the basics. The basic position in China is that they are banned. So Chinese regulators, for some of the same reasons I talked about before, not very keen on ICOs. Understandably, a lot of the Chinese reports, and even what Derek said earlier, there's a large number of ICOs where they basically don't disclose sufficient information to investors to allow investors to make an informed decision as to some of the risks related to the investment. And the Chinese regulators also pointed out that in their experience, a lot of the ICOs are basically frauds or shams, and they don't want members of the public to be involved in that. But with a jurisdiction that's as large as China, as complicated, with as many people, sometimes it's hard for them to come out with a guidance that's sort of very nuanced, with sort of different tests as to what is and what's not an IPO. So they just basically came out with sort of an outright ban that says ICOs, illegal in China, not allowed to do it. And that was towards the end of last year. And towards the end of this year, just to show you that the regulatory landscape in terms of the regulatory attitude towards ICOs in China hasn't really changed very much. The People's Bank of China, which is the central bank in China, they issue what's called a China Financial Stability Report every year, which basically highlights some of the risks in China's financial system. And this year they had a special section. I think there's only 12 sections. One of the sections was about crypto assets, and they talked about the history of crypto assets, some of the risks related to it as well. And then one of the key recommendations they made is that the Chinese financial regulators will take what's called substance of reform approach in terms of targeting ICOs and making sure that people aren't sort of disguising ICOs as some type of other investment in order to do it. So really focusing on the substance. One of the things that they specifically called out for were sort of the airdrops, which is quite common, where basically free tokens are issued to potential investors, but the founders keep a group of tokens for themselves, and then they basically bank on the fact that once these tokens increase in value, then their own tokens increase in value. So those types of things, Chinese regulators not very, very excited about. So if you only looked at the two topics I talked about, you would think that China has a very negative attitude towards fintech, but I can assure you that that's not the case. I mean, Huobi wouldn't have 30,000 high achievers working on blockchain technology and all of that if that were the case. And China wouldn't have 5 of the top 10 fintech companies in the world if the government did not encourage fintech innovation. So the next two topics I want to talk about are more positive stories, I guess. Central bank digital currency. So remember before I was talking about the distinction between a virtual currency or cryptocurrency versus an official currency. And one of the differences is that one, it's not backed by the government, you can't really force somebody to accept it for payments of private and public debts. So what the PBOC, which is China's central bank, and a lot of other central banks around the world are trying to do is to say, you know what, instead of you guys, you know, investing in virtual currencies and bitcoins and other things, we're going to issue our own official currency that's in the form of a digital currency. And the PBOC is actually one of the first regulators to announce that they're exploring this space. So I think they made the announcement in January of 2016, which was quite early. And again, the key distinction between a central bank digital currency, often referred to as a CBDC, versus you know, an unofficial, unregulated Bitcoin or crypto asset, is that it's backed by the sovereign credit. It's the official currency, so you can use it just as you would use the dollar notes that you have in your wallet. Chinese government is very keen about the advantages of having its own official digital currency, and it talks about a lot of these advantages. You know, lower costs of issuing, because you know, once it's digitized form, then you don't have to mint coins, you don't have to print money, and they actually get worn out pretty quickly, especially in China, where there's a lot of you know, it's paper and there's a lot of people you know, changing hands. So the other thing is that the PBOC actually sees the digitization of the RMB as the next step in China's digital economy. I was talking about paper notes, but as most of you know who's been to China recently, people actually don't use paper notes in China anymore. Everything is sort of a QR code and digital anyway. So actually it's not there's a lot of infrastructure and legal differences, but from a consumer's perspective, there's actually not that much difference between, you know, a QR code and transacting using sort of these digital currencies. The customer or the user-facing experience is actually not that different. I talked about currency, monetary policy, monitoring illegal activities, capital flows, foreign exchange controls, and things like that. If you have a central bank digital currency, it's a lot easier for the central bank to monitor all of that, because it can basically see everything. Whereas now it can see most things, but if you just took a large bag of cash and came to Australia and nobody checked you, they won't be able to see that, right? So there's sort of, if they move to a purely digital currency model, they can monitor the flow of money better, which you know, helps prevent illegal acts, but also just from a monetary policy perspective, it actually makes monetary policy execution a lot more effective. So PBOC is pretty keen about digital currency. One of the things that, you know, I'll go into this a little bit more in more detail later. The PBOC has said in a number of places that the concept of the central bank digital currency is a concept, but it's not tied to a particular technology. So it said that it may be based on blockchain, but not necessarily. And as you'll see later, the PBOC, unlike a number of other Chinese regulators, has a particular view about blockchain technology that's not as rosy or as sort of positive as some of the other regulators. And then, despite the fact that the PBOC has already started talking about digital currencies as early as 2016, we haven't really seen something officially roll out yet, and I don't think you should be holding your breath for something to come out anytime soon. China has 1.4 billion people. It's a very large economy, and I said, like I said before, the government cares very much about financial stability and social stability. So they're not going to roll out a digital currency sort of overnight, right? It's going to be gradual. It's going to be very slow. You know, changing the currency from one to another, that's sort of one of the biggest things that an economy can do. So there's basically zero margin of error involved, and China knows that. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to be very cautious. They're going to run a lot of trials. They might test it with some banks first to see if it works. Might extend it out to a couple of over a long period of time to sort of the ordinary citizens in China. So it's a space to watch. Very, very interesting space, but probably nothing immediate in this area. And then finally, I want to talk. China needs to be sort of in the driver's seat in as well. So from that perspective, there's a lot of policy push towards the development of blockchain technology in China. And as you can imagine, when you have the top leadership in China talking so much about blockchain and encouraging blockchain, basically everyone in China jumps on the blockchain bandwagon. So central government agencies, local government agencies, more or less have all come out with various statements saying, we encourage blockchain, we want to do more in blockchain. Private sector as well. So this is just an interesting statistic. So this number probably doubled by now since it's a couple months old. But basically, 456 Chinese companies expressly identified themselves as having blockchain as their primary business. Obviously, you've got a lot of the larger fintech players such as Alibaba, Baidu, and Tangxun, who are basically also developing blockchain as well. So basically, from the smallest startups to the universities, to the research labs, to government agencies, to the larger players in the Chinese internet market, everyone is very excited about blockchain. Everyone probably except the PBOC. So the PBOC came out with a working paper just a couple days ago. It's called What Blockchain Can and Cannot Do, and probably this part, if they could have, they probably should have underlined that. It's really about the report kind of downplays the blockchain. And it's understandable if you think about where the PBOC is coming from or what type of regulation it is. It's the central bank in China. It's one of the key regulators in China that's responsible for containing financial risk and making sure that there's not a sort of a bubble in China's investment atmosphere. There's not a bubble in China's financial sector. So the last thing that this type of regulator wants to do is to say blockchain is great, everyone should be involved in blockchain, because when people read that and it's from the PBOC, people will put all of their money, if they haven't already, into blockchain, and that would create a speculation, that would create a bubble, and that's not what the PBOC wants. So I think from that perspective, it's understandable. It talks about some of the limitations in blockchain. Yes.
In that paper, if I could ask a question now, I read a report that certain companies can accept certain crypto, such as Bitcoin. While they're not obliged to as legal tender, they can accept Bitcoin and several other crypto coins as payment.
I think, and that goes back to the earlier point about the status of Bitcoin and other things. It's basically as an asset, right? And so private citizens, I can trade my chair for your beer, for example, right? It's my asset and that's your asset, we can do that. It's a barter. And that generally is not prohibited. But if you start doing it as a business, say I'll accept all of your coins in exchange for RMB. When it gets to enough scale that it becomes a business and you're in exchange, then that's when Chinese regulators want to start regulating and prohibiting.
But they didn't allow Alibaba to accept it. I think they have, haven't they?
I think you can generally accept it, but probably not. Again, I think if the scale becomes such that it's about scale. It's about the context. If you were to accept it to facilitate taking RMB out of China or changing it to US dollars, things like that. They don't know. So they talked some of the things. I won't go into detail, but some of the things they talked about. Derek mentioned as well. Sort of, it's not a trust machine, right? The blockchain is only as good as the inputs that you put into it. If the input is corrupted, is not accurate, then blockchain somehow won't make it the truth, right? So there are some limitations which legitimately are sort of things that so what they're trying to say is that blockchain isn't going to solve all of the world's problems, which is obvious to some people, but it may not be obvious to some retailers. So finally, this is the thing I actually wanted to spend more time on, is China's blockchain regulation. So what I said before is there's all these statements from regulators in China saying blockchain is great, it's the next big thing, it's the frontier technology, whatever. But they encourage it, and there's white papers talking about potential uses and everything. But until last month, there's never been any regulation or proposed regulation in China that's directed at blockchain as a technology. And in fact, not many around the world that does that. So the Chinese regulator, basically the Chinese regulator, I don't have the name here, but it was on one of the earlier slides. It's basically the China Cyber Administration, the Cyber Administration of China, or CAC, came out with proposed regulations on blockchain technology. So the CAC is basically China's internet regulator. So I guess the first question is, what is an internet regulator doing trying to regulate blockchain? So there are two answers to this question. The first is that blockchain technology, and especially the delivery of blockchain technology, is going to be inextricably linked to the internet and big data. And I think over time, especially given how mobile technology and internet is very prevalent in China, that's going to be the main medium through which blockchain is going to be delivered. The second reason is more specific, and I won't go into a lot of details here. You can find out all about it on Drupal. But what triggered this particular regulation was earlier this year there were some Chinese individuals that basically engaged in transactions on blockchains, not necessarily for the sake of engaging in the transactions themselves, but in order to disseminate certain information on the blockchain. So when they did a transaction, they attached information in the blockchain. And that information, I think suffice to say, was something that the government didn't really want to be very widely disseminated. And then I think because of that incident and that series of incidents, the government realized that we need to have some kind of regulation in this space, because the current political and social environment in China is that the government does like to have some kind of censorship over certain types of information. So if you know that case and you know that example, then a lot of the contents of this regulation makes sense, because it's basically targeting blockchain from a cybersecurity, from an information security perspective. So it starts off by saying, this rule is going to apply to blockchain information services, which is very broad, and it actually applies to both the service providers and the individual users themselves. The scope basically is anytime somebody provides an internet or application-based blockchain service, or a kind of service that has the underlying technology as blockchain, which is not very well defined, and that service is offered to members of the Chinese public, it gets caught by this rule. So it's still a proposed rule, there's still some uncertainties, but if you read it on its, based on its plain meaning, it's broad enough to capture situations where the service provider is outside of China, but is targeting Chinese users in China. In that kind of situation, the rule could apply. What it requires as a sort of a first requirement is for these blockchain information service providers to make a registration and filing with the Chinese CAC, the Chinese Internet Regulator. So basically they complete a form that basically says what they do, a bit about themselves, and they register or file it with the Chinese Internet Regulator. According to the rules, if everything seems to be complete, they basically receive a registration number. And if you often go to Chinese websites, you often see sort of a little funny logo at the bottom and it has a registration number. It's a kind of a similar regime. Basically, just as websites, large websites in China have to be officially registered, blockchain services in the future has to be officially registered, and they have to quote their sort of registration number going forward. The other thing, that's how the regulator knows who all of these potential service providers are. And then comes the substantive requirements, obligations. So, and as I mentioned before, most of them relate to information security, cybersecurity, and security assessment. So what this actually means, for example, is one of the key provisions in the regulation kind of says, if the blockchain service provider discovers that the illegal information or information that threatens social security or national security, if that information is detected in their blockchain, then they have to take immediate action, including deleting the information ASAP. Then they have to take action against the users, possibly expelling the user from the service, and also cooperating with Chinese regulators, basically in terms of enforcement action against both the provider and against the user themselves. Yeah.
How does one go about deleting the information?
I was gonna get to that. I mean, why don't I get to it now? So one of the this rule is very reactionary. Incidents happen, and the Chinese regulators said, "We've got to do something about it. We've got to send a signal that this kind of thing is not acceptable. It's not acceptable in the internet. It's not going to be acceptable in blockchain." So it's a very there's a number of commentary that talks about the proposed rule, and one of the things that they mention is that the rule doesn't really take into account the immutable nature of blockchain. It doesn't even take into account the sort of decentralized nature of blockchain at all. It treats blockchain just as sort of another internet kind of thing that you can just regulate from top down, whereas the nature of blockchain doesn't really lend to that. The other thing that they want to do at the user end of things is real identity authentication. This is something that was introduced a similar concept was introduced in the cybersecurity law in China, and it's in place in a number of platforms already on the internet. Basically, if you want to access sort of a significant web service in China, you've got to tell people your real name, got to tell them your national ID number, your phone number, so that if you happen to post information that's not very nice about something, they can basically track you down. And so that's, these two are linked, right? So the service provider has an obligation to detect that information, but also the users, in order to access the service in the first place, has to reveal their real name and identity, and that is designed to be a deterrent for people to disseminate that information on an anonymous basis. And the regulation is not very long. There's only about 30 clauses. Again, very high level, doesn't go into a lot of details. But even though there's only 30 clauses, there's about 4 or 5 clauses that talk about the specific consequences and severe consequences for breaching the regulation. So you can see that they're looking at this from an enforcement perspective as well. I'll just talk a little bit about the current status of the regulation. So as I said a number of times, it's only a proposal. They left it open to comments from the public, and a number of academics as well as members of the Chinese blockchain community have basically, publicly made a number of suggestions about this proposal. One of the things I said was it doesn't really take into account the nature of blockchain. The other criticism or sort of suggestion, I guess, is that this type of regime whereby you require registration, the other thing it requires is an annual security review or security assessment by the regulator of the blockchain. It doesn't go into detail about how long that's going to take, what's that going to involve, and if you don't pass it, what's going to happen. There's another type of assessment that basically says that anytime you add a new feature or a function to your blockchain, so basically anytime you upgrade, basically anytime you innovate, you've got to go through a security assessment first. So the concern is that if you have all of these assessments, reviews, registrations, filings, that could really slow down the innovation process, right? And it could stymie innovation in the blockchain sector. So there's a number of views about this blockchain regulation, and we'll see whether some of these comments are sort of taken on board. I mean, some of the commentators are very well known within the Chinese blockchain community, and actually sort of the senior academics and whatnot. So we'll see where that is. But I think, again, just to end on a positive note, setting this particular regulation aside, the general sort of environment or landscape in China around blockchain and around fintech is still very encouraging. So that's everything I wanted to say.
I have a question about this. I haven't read the Chinese regulation yet. So, but based on what you said, it sounds like they're really targeting the cryptocurrency type of blockchain information services, or are they applied to any sort of services uses blockchain as a base?
Yeah, so it's very broad. It's any type of service that delivers blockchain-based. So it's a service that is based on blockchain technology that is delivered to Chinese members of the Chinese public through the internet or a website or a web app.
Mentioned Bitcoin on WeChat, maybe cut off.
I'll let others answer that. I can open up that question to the room.
I was just interested in those key frontier technologies.
Mm-hmm.
What are they?
So I think it's big data.
Yeah.
It's blockchain. It's AI, and I think the other one is sort of related to Internet of Things.
Okay.
So it's those areas, which and the practical applications of those would be things like driverless cars, which Biden was very excited about. So all of the things that that sort of China views as the next big thing that's going to give China a competitive edge, frankly, over the US and over other countries in terms of technological innovation.
Probably time for a couple more questions.
So why do you think fintech has developed so quickly in China?
That's a very good question. So I think if you think about Australia, you think about other Western and other jurisdictions in Asia, sort of developed economies, the way our financial services sector has evolved is sort of, and I say evolved deliberately, it's very gradual. We have checkbooks, we have credit cards, and then we have now mobile payments. And so we started with cash, and it's a very gradual process. And there are still people that use traveler's checks and checkbooks when they travel overseas. So it's a very gradual process, and there's sort of a lot of infrastructure out there, right? All of the most stores will still have sort of the tap thing. They still have this EPOS machines and all of that. There's still ATMs. There's a lot of infrastructure. In China, I think because it's gone through such a rapid economic growth transformation, it's more like a revolution. A lot of these steps are sort of skipped. It's like in China, there's not a lot of landlines, and the people moved to mobile. Didn't do a lot of flip phones for a while. Everyone moved to smartphones. So a lot of the existing infrastructure that could sometimes slow down innovation because there's all these established sort of players that doesn't exist as much in China, and that's really allowed fintech to grow very quickly in China.
Thank you.
One last question? Otherwise, finally, thank you again to Andrew and Derek, and also thank you very much to Elmi Chang, who's our colleague who helped pull the evening together and organise it. So thank you everybody for coming. Round of applause for the speakers. Feel free to mingle. Elmi, can we get more drinks in here, or will everyone go back into the kitchen, or perhaps just stay in here?
Yeah, maybe,
So thank you very much.
yeah.
Feel free to stay
Cool.
and chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
我们把它带到厨房去。